They cried as if the world were ending, but no one heard. The black plastic muffled the screams, the cold sliced their skin, and the stench of garbage seemed stronger than fear itself. 3 newborns, still slick with blood and birth, curled up between rotting food and used syringes. The bag trembled, but no one noticed. It was the middle of the night, and the empty lot had been forgotten by everyone, except them. One of the babies stopped crying for a few seconds. The silence hurt, more than the sound, but then a new cry ripped through the night like a desperate plea for anyone, someone. And someone heard. He was walking slowly, the way someone walks when they expect nothing good from the world. A fine linen jacket, shoes too clean for that street. He wasn't there out of curiosity, but out of exhaustion. Boredom had taken him. Through neighborhoods his kind pretended didn't exist, but in that instant he heard it. A thin, uneven sound. A whimper from a life trying to exist. He stopped. His tired eyes searched for the source, but everything looked like part of an urban nightmare. Then he saw it. The black plastic bag, oddly alive, moving among the debris. He stepped closer. The heart that hadn't raced for anything in years stumbled. In his chest, he knelt down, opened it. 3 tiny faces, eyes shut, bodies still streaked with dried blood. One had the umbilical cord wrapped around its belly. He swallowed the disgust and shock in a single breath, said nothing, just looked. For long moments, he only looked, as if seeing a forgotten reflection of his own soul. But there was something he didn't know yet. He touched the first baby with the tip of his fingers, cold. Immediately he took off his cashmere coat, laid it on the ground, placed the babies on it, and wrapped them as best he could. He was trembling, not from the cold, from something he hadn't named since he was 23, back when he still believed someone could love without an agenda. He stood up with the 3 in his arms. No one saw him cross the lot. No one questioned him on the empty street. He entered the car like he was carrying dynamite, told the driver to go but didn't say where. He ended up taking them to the only place where he felt even slightly alive, his own home. The mansion, made of marble, glass, and silence, seemed to swallow their cries like a black hole of emotion. But there, in the middle of the living room, surrounded by art he no longer noticed, he laid the 3 on a Persian rug and lit the fireplace. And just when he thought he had done something significant, one of them stopped moving. His chest froze. He laid down beside them, touched the baby's chest, searched for signs. Alive but weak. Very weak. And then it hit him. Saving them wasn't enough. They needed care. He stood like a man realizing his fortune might finally be useful. Called an old friend, doctor, didn't explain much, just said, 3 lives, hurry. And while the doctor was on his way, he sat beside them. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone, but there was something in that cry that seemed to come from within him too. The doctor arrived 15 minutes later, still in pajamas, pale with shock. Barely looked at the man of the house. Knelt directly before the babies and began to examine them with steady hands. The millionaire stood still, like a man watching a trial where he was both guilty and judge. They're weak. One nearly went into hypothermia. 10 more minutes and he didn't answer. Just closed his eyes and clenched his fists. He had money to buy time, but never learned how to use it for anyone but himself. And now 3 lives depended on choices he didn't know how to make. The doctor sensed the hesitation. I can't take them to a hospital without involving the police. You understand that? He nodded without looking up. They stay, I'll care for them, but no one can know. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. The doctor opened his bag, pulled out IV fluids, wipes, gloves, and for the first time in decades, the millionaire knelt to learn, took instructions, helped clean the tiny bodies, held needles with trembling fingers. It was a ritual of silent redemption. As they administered fluids, he remembered, not another baby. Himself, his name was Edward Hale, only son of an oil tycoon who never hugged him. His mother died young, and his father never learned to say son without checking the bank balance first. He grew up among tutors, butlers, and cold stone hallways. The only tenderness he ever knew came from an Italian housekeeper who used to call him Piccolo. She died when he was 12. His father didn't attend the funeral, but in that moment, something inside him began to break. It wasn't pity he felt for the babies. It was anger. Anger at a world that let them rot in trash, just like he, emotionally, had been left to rot in mansions. Caring for them wasn't noble. It was a scream, a desperate act by a man trying to make sense of what little he had left. The doctor finished his work. The babies were sleeping now, warm, clean, a bit less fragile. Silence returned to the room, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it was filled with promise. The doctor left with just one sentence. "If you're really going to do this, you'll have to stop being the man you are." The door closed. Edward stood there, staring into the fire. The flames reflected in the eyes of the small bodies lying on the floor. He thought about shareholders, the press, the chaos, if word got out. But none of those images moved him. What moved him was a memory. The last time he cried at 10 years old, hiding in the basement, when the housekeeper was taken away without warning. No one came looking for him. He crouched, touched the smallest baby's face. Its eyes opened, blue like his. For a second, Edward saw a mirror, but also something else, a beginning. And that thought scared him. But there was something he didn't know yet. The babies weren't just alive, they had names. Even if he didn't know them. Stories, roots, wounds older than his arrival. And over time, those pasts would come looking for them. But that night, there was only him. And one question that pulsed in silence. What if I mess this up? He didn't know how to hold them, didn't know how to soothe, didn't know how to love. But there, in the middle of cold luxury, he decided he would learn. Because for the first time, the emptiness screamed louder than the contracts, and then one of them smiled in his sleep, and Edward cried, quietly, without gasping, like someone finally letting go. The sun rose uninvited, slicing through the mansion's stained glass with colors that felt foreign to a house so used to shadow. Edward hadn't slept. He sat all night by the fire, guarding the three like someone, keeping a dangerous secret. There was something unsettling in the calm, as if he knew the real test hadn't even begun. At exactly 7, Clara, the housekeeper, walked in through the side door, just as she had for 20 years, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and the punctuality of someone who had learned not to expect surprises. But that morning she found 3, lying on the living room floor, wrapped in an expensive blanket, with her employer kneeling beside them, eyes hollow and hands stained with milk. She froze. "Mr. Hale, what is this?" He stood up slowly. His voice came out hoarse, as if unused. "For days. 3 lives. I found them in a vacant lot. I brought them here." She looked at the babies, then at him. The shock in her eyes wasn't judgment. It was fear and love. Clara had always been more mother than employee, and she knew that in this house nothing stayed pure for long. And now they stay, for as long as they need. But there was something he wasn't ready to hear. "You don't know what you're doing." She was firm. Clara had never spoken to him like that. But Edward had also never done something so far outside the lines. She stepped closer to the babies, looked at them carefully. The smallest still had dried blood behind his ear. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and gently wiped it away. "They need more than shelter, Mr. Hale. They need arms to hold them, milk to feed them. Someone who can tell when they're in pain. I'll learn. Love isn't something you learn like numbers. You feel it." The silence between them was heavy. Edward bore the weight of a man who had always been served, never challenged. But now he had to convince someone who knew him better than he knew himself. "Clara, don't ask me to give up. Not now." She took a deep breath, looked him in the eyes, and she saw it. For the first time in 2 decades, she saw fear in him. Real fear. Not the kind that comes with losing stock, but the kind that comes with losing something you don't even know how to name. "I'll help you," she said, "but I need to know what are you going to tell the world?" That was the wall. The first major emotional barrier. The house could hide them for a while. But the world didn't forgive wealthy men who broke the mold. 3 babies without names, taken in without a legal process. The media would destroy his reputation, shareholders would demand answers, and the law could take them away. But then, he remembered the doctor's voice. "You're going to have to stop being the man you are." Edward didn't reply. He walked to the library, pulled out a folder. Inside, blank documents, but with his official letterhead. He wrote down 3 fictitious names, added birth dates, signed, then looked at Clara. "We'll create a story for now," she nodded. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. He needed this just as much as those babies did, but there was something he still didn't know. The story they were inventing would one day collide with a deeper truth, the baby's real origin, and what brought them there. But that day the battle was different. Edward spent the morning trying to bottle feed. He fumbled with diapers, spilled more milk than he managed to give, but he smiled. Clara had never seen this. A man used to giving orders, now learning to serve. He laughed at his own mistakes, got his clothes dirty and didn't care, touched each tiny body with reverence. And by late afternoon, exhausted, he fell asleep on the couch. One of the babies, the one with the shorter cord, slept on his chest, as if that cold body had finally learned what warmth was. But that night, someone knocked on the door. The knock sounded ordinary, but in that moment, every sound carried too much weight. Clara rushed to the front hall, steadying her breath. Edward woke abruptly, eyes still foggy. The baby on his chest stirred, as if sensing something was about to change. Clara opened the door cautiously. It was a delivery man, a package, no threat, but the fear had already been planted. "It's okay, sir. Just a package." Edward nodded, but his gaze didn't settle again. He felt it, that sense that things were shifting. This improvised life, no matter how beautiful, stood on unstable ground, and the first winds of the storm didn't take long. 2 days later, a tabloid journalist posted a small note at the bottom of a local news site. "Eccentric millionaire seen carrying objects wrapped in blankets." Nothing serious, but just enough to spark curiosity. Most ignored the article, but not the ones who thrived on scandal. Edward called Clara and the doctor. They all knew the secret was on life support. They decided to close the mansion's curtains, limit entrances, keep the babies far from any windows. The house became a cocoon, but a cocoon made of glass. And suddenly, it all began to weigh more. The exhaustion set in. Not the physical kind, he knew that well. This was different. An emotional fatigue from playing a role he had never rehearsed for. The nighttime feedings, the colic, the unexplained cries. Clara helped, but she couldn't do everything. And for the first time, Edward felt anger at himself, at his ignorance, at how easy it was to donate money, but how hard it was to give patience. One night, he locked himself in his room, sat in the leather chair and broke down. He cried in silence, head in his hands. He felt weak, useless. The kind of man life had trained to run empires, but who didn't know how to soothe a baby with a fever. But there was something he still didn't know. While he was breaking down inside, Clara saw it all with a mother's eyes, and it was she who at dawn would find him asleep beside the makeshift crib, holding one of the baby's hands with fingers stained in dried milk. But the world didn't wait. The following week, a woman appeared at the front gate, young, pale, eyes wide with desperation. She held an old photo of a pregnant belly, said she was looking for 3 babies who had disappeared from an abandoned shelter. No one let her in, but Edward found out, and his stomach turned. Could she be the mother? Maybe, or bait, we don't know. But if she is, you can't take that risk, not without knowing the truth. Edward locked the gates, installed cameras, hired a private security guard, but each new layer of protection only made the fragility more obvious. He wasn't their legal father. He had no rights. One tip, one judge, one order, and everything could fall apart. Trying to live normally failed. Pediatricians refused house calls when they learned the babies had no documents. No nanny would accept the job without a contract. And Clara, now aging, was starting to slow down. So he tried the impossible, to disappear. Not from life, but from the headlines. He sold off company shares, stepped down from the board, cancelled all public appearances the media noticed. Speculation began. Is he sick? Scandal brewing? But no one imagined the truth fit inside a crib. Yet there was still something he didn't know. By protecting the babies, he was also awakening buried forces from his own past. His childhood began echoing back with fury. At night, he dreamed of the basement, the cold, the emptiness, of the housekeeper who called him Piccolo and vanished without a word, and in the baby's cries, he heard that echo. Then, on a rainy midnight, just when everything seemed calm, a shadow jumped the wall. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like. The shadow moved with precision. It knew where the cameras were, where to step without making noise. It climbed the side of the mansion and reached the backyard. The rain masked its sound. Upstairs, Edward was dozing. Off, the smallest baby resting on his lap. Clara, exhausted, slept in the living room. The newly hired guard was making rounds at the front. No one saw. The ground floor window gave way easily. The hooded figure slipped inside like a ghost and, then, drawn by scent or instinct, it moved toward the baby's room, stopped at the crib. Stood still, eyes hidden in the shadows, locked on the sleeping child. Hands trembled. That's when Clara woke up with a gut feeling that sliced through her chest like a blade. She rose, unsure why, but something pulled her. When she reached the hallway, she saw the door cracked open. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she simply pushed it open and saw him, a man, standing still, rain soaking his face, his hands inches from the baby. "Who are you?" He turned slowly. His eyes were wet, but not from rain, from something else, something older. "They're mine." Clara's eyes widened. The tension in the room was like a wire pulled taut, and just then, Edward appeared behind her, holding the baby in his arms. He saw the intruder, and rage ignited before reason. "Get out! Now!" The man took one step forward. Edward stepped in front, shielding the children with his body. "I don't know who you are, but if you touch them, I'll end you." The intruder raised his hands, surrendering but resolute. "I'm their mother's brother. She died during childbirth. I thought they were gone, but I heard someone said a rich man saved them." Clara looked at Edward. He, without taking his eyes off the man, spoke in a low voice. "How did you find us?" "A neighbor said she saw something strange. 3 bundles, a black bag, and a fancy car." The tension turned to a knot. The man didn't seem to be lying, but that didn't mean he could be trusted. "Just give me a minute with them, please." Edward hesitated, rage tangled with fear and doubt. "I can't. They're mine now." "They're not. Not legally. And you know that." Clara stepped in. "Mr. Hale, maybe he could help. Or destroy everything." Then came the near breaking point. Edward left the room holding the baby, entered his study, locked the door, screamed silently. The world was invading. What he thought he had managed to build. He felt powerless, like a child again, locked in the basement, hearing footsteps above but unable to call out. But there was something he still didn't know. The man Daniel hadn't come to destroy. He came because he dreamed about his nephews every night since they vanished. He was simple, poor, but he didn't want to take them, just to know them. But Edward no longer believed in human promises. So, that night, he sent Daniel away, had the security guard escort him to the gate. No yelling, just silence. But as the gate closed, Edward saw in Daniel's eyes something more painful than any threat. Pure disappointment. Not with him, but with the world. The same kind Edward felt whenever he thought of his father. In the days that followed, guilt grew. Clara barely spoke to him. The babies caught a minor virus, and everything felt like it was slipping away. One night, Edward fell asleep on the floor, feverish and drenched in sweat. He dreamed of losing all 3, woke up screaming. Clara found him trembling, murmuring, "I'm not enough. I never was." She knelt beside him, held his face firmly. "Are you scared?" He nodded. "Then feel it. But don't run. They need that. A man who feels, even if he's broken." But there was something he still didn't know. What had started as an impulsive act was becoming love, real, painful. And the more he felt, the more afraid he became of losing. But it was already too late. The bond was there, and while he stroked the sweaty hair of one of the babies, a letter arrived in the mail, a manila envelope. No return address. Inside, a copy of an old document, a name, and a threat. The letter was short, 3 lines. A veiled threat, and a name that froze Edward's blood. Richard Hale, his father. His hands shook as he held the paper. Clara noticed the shift in his expression, stepped closer, cautiously. Edward still stared at the envelope like it might start breathing. "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer, just handed her the letter. Clara read it in silence. The name alone was enough. Richard Hale was never a father. He was an empire, a crushing force. Edward had cut him off decades ago, after a fight that ended in shouting, threats, and the sentence that still echoed in his head. "You're a disappointment even when you try to love." Now he was back. Not directly, but the warning was clear. He knew, and if Richard knew, the world would know soon too. That night, Edward didn't eat, didn't speak, sat in the garden under the cold wind, letting the past close in from every direction. He remembered his father in the cold halls of his childhood home, the harsh gaze, the absence. He remembered trying to run away at 15, being dragged back, and at 21, buying his freedom with silence. But there was something he still didn't know. Richard had never forgotten. He had only waited for the right moment to settle the score, and now, with grandchildren who weren't really his, the old man saw a chance to reclaim control. 2 days later, it arrived. A court summons. Official, an emergency guardianship case. It claimed Edward was mentally unstable. A danger to 3 defenseless children. Attached were photos of the lot where the babies had been found. Images of the trash bag. Someone had been watching all along. Edward collapsed. Not metaphorically. Literally. He hit the floor in the study. Clara found him hours later. Clammy, disoriented, barely speaking, he kept repeating, I failed. She helped him sit, breathe. But something inside him had shattered harder than before. This wasn't just a legal fall. It was emotional. For the first time, he considered giving up, handing the babies over, disappearing for good. But then, one of the babies rolled over on the blanket and let out a soft sound, almost like laughter. Edward looked and broke down in tears, warm, unguarded tears, the kind that come when you realize you're too small for everything you're trying to protect. In the days that followed, he refused food, avoided Clara's gaze, sat for hours holding the babies, but not touching them like before. It was as if he didn't want to bond further, as if he was silently saying goodbye. Clara tried everything, talked about courage, redemption, about love born from desperation, but nothing reached him. Edward became a shadow. And then Daniel came back. He didn't climb a wall. He rang the doorbell, brought paperwork, had done his own research, discovered the birth story. His sister, addicted to opioids, had died during labor, abandoned by everyone. The babies had been taken by traffickers for negotiation. But when the deal turned to garbage, literally, someone felt guilt and dropped the bag in the lot. Daniel cried as he told it. Didn't blame anyone. He just said, "Don't lose them now. They need you, not me." Edward couldn't respond. But Clara saw something inside him stirred. But there was something he still didn't know. Richard didn't just want custody revoked. He wanted to destroy Edward entirely. He hired top lawyers, filed multiple suits, mobilized the press, called his son a kidnapper on national television. The mansion became surrounded by cameras, reporters, drones, A court hearing was scheduled, 15 days out. And on the night before the hearing, Edward stood in front of the mirror. He saw new wrinkles, dark circles, but he also saw the eyes of 3 babies reflected behind him. They were asleep, breathing softly, as if they trusted him. And in that silence he whispered, "I don't know if I can do this, daughter, but I won't let you be alone." The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. It was Saturday night. Time slipped away like fine sand. Edward, now a thinner, quieter silhouette, wandered the mansion's halls without aim. The house felt emptier than ever, even with the 3 little ones filling every emotional corner of his days. Clara watched with the eyes of a wounded mother. She knew something had to change. Fighting in court wasn't enough. He had to heal from within, because despite his quiet love for the babies, Edward still carried the hollow shell of a child never loved. So she made a decision. She took the car and left, without saying a word. Edward noticed only that night when he went to the kitchen and found it too quiet. He called, texted. Nothing. Fear hit him like a rogue wave. For the first time in weeks, he was truly alone. Clara was gone. Daniel didn't answer, and the 3 babies, asleep in separate rooms, suddenly felt more distant than ever. And in that void, he realized something. He had never said father with love, never called anyone that, without fear. He sat in the dark living room and for the first time said aloud, "I don't know how to be a father, but I want to be." The words came out shaky, childlike, and they echoed as if the ceiling itself had heard, but there was something he still didn't know. Clara hadn't run away. She had gone to see a woman named Margot, a retired child psychologist, an old friend. Margot had once been the only person who tried to understand Edward as a boy, but his father had driven her away. Now Clara begged her to come back. Just for one conversation. Margot hesitated. Go. She was old, tired, but when she heard the story, she grabbed her coat. On Sunday morning, Clara returned with Margot at her side. Edward was confused by the older woman. White hair, penetrating eyes. He tried to withdraw, but Clara stood firm. "Sit. Listen. That's all." Margot sat in the garden with him. The sun was soft, the breeze gentle. The babies were napping, and Edward, tired of running, sat too. "I met you when you were 7, do you remember?" He shook his head. "Of course you don't, you'd already forgotten yourself." Silence. "You were a boy with hollow eyes. You held your toys like they were grenades. You never smiled at me. But you drew, one day you drew a house completely black. No windows, no doors, just walls." Edward closed his eyes. The image came back, the paper, the crayon, the housekeeper trying to take it away. His father tearing it up and saying, "Don't be dramatic. Today, you're trying to put windows in that house, but you're still afraid of the light," he cried softly, like someone finally recognizing their own shadow. Margot touched his hand. "These babies, they're not your chance at redemption. They're a mirror. You see in them what you wished you had been, loved, protected, wanted, and do you know why it hurts so much right now? Because you're starting to truly love them." That night, Edward didn't sleep. But for the first time, he didn't feel anguish. He stayed beside the cribs, he sang off-key, he soothed them. He watched each breath, and something inside him began to realign. But there was something he still didn't know. Margot was keeping a secret. An old psychological report, never submitted to the courts, withheld out of fear of retaliation. Diagnosis proving that at age 7, Edward suffered from extreme emotional neglect. Clara had found the document in the archives of the clinic where Margot once worked. And now it could become a powerful emotional weapon in court. The next morning, the babies woke up at the same time, as if coordinated. 3 distinct cries, 3 needs. And Edward, standing tall, steady, handled it, one at a time, with trembling hands, yes, but with a presence that hadn't been there before. By late morning, when Daniel showed up with new clothes for the children, Edward didn't refuse. He invited him in, asked for help. Together, the 2 men dressed the babies, a former executive and an orphaned brother, united by something neither of them could name. Monday dawned brighter than any day in weeks. Edward woke before sunrise. His suit was ready, but he hesitated. That suit had always been his armor. But today it felt wrong, like it no longer fit the man he was becoming. In the mirror he saw a different reflection, still tired, still fighting, but with something new in his eyes, presence. He was there, fully, and that was enough. Downstairs, Clara dressed the babies, with steady hands and a restless heart. Daniel helped in silence. Time was short, but the love was vast. One of the babies, the one with the hoarser cry, grabbed Edward's finger with surprising strength, as if to say, "Go, I'll wait," and Edward went. Margot waited in the car with Clara. They brought more than documents. They carried memories, proof that not all trauma has to repeat itself, that love, even late, can be healing. At the courthouse, the room was cold, polished, impersonal. Richard was already there, standing tall in his suit, aged, yes, but with the same look he always had, the belief that money could win any war. When he saw his son enter, he smiled, but it was a hollow, strategic smile. "So this is it, Edward. You're going to ruin yourself over 3 scraps of flesh tossed in the trash." The words hit like a slap. But Edward didn't flinch. He met his father's eyes, and they didn't shake. "I'm trying not to become you." The hearing began. The judge was strict. Richard's lawyers fired off arguments like bullets, instability, recklessness, unfit environment. No legal guardianship. Clara was called to testify. She spoke briefly, but precisely. She talked about the long nights, the dedication, the man she'd watched be reborn. Daniel testified as well, admitted the baby's origin, told what he knew, said he couldn't raise them, but that Edward was by far the best thing that had ever happened to those children. But there was something no one expected. Margot requested to speak. The judge hesitated but allowed it. She opened her folder, pulled out the old report, dated, signed, and stamped. "Your Honor, this is a report from over 30 years ago. It proves that Mr. Edward Hale was diagnosed with severe emotional neglect during childhood. It was withheld from the justice system at the request of his father, Richard Hale, to protect the family's public image." The judge raised an eyebrow. Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. Margot continued. "This man who was prevented from loving or being loved is now trying to break that cycle with his hands, his heart, and what time he has left. He's not a savior, he's a survivor. And more than that, he is a father." The courtroom fell silent. Edward felt his eyes fill, but he held steady. For the first time, not as the Hale heir, but as a man who chose to stand. But there was something he still didn't know. At the end of the hearing, the judge requested a recess, said he needed to consider the full context, gave 72 hours for a final decision, 3 days, a limbo. Edward returned home with Clara and the babies. Silence in the car. But it was a different kind of silence. There was no defeat, only waiting. In the days that followed, Edward allowed himself to live as a father, with no guarantees. He woke to their cries, cooked meals for Clara, showered with a baby in his arms, sat at night telling made-up stories, and in each gesture he rebuilt not only his bond with the babies, but with himself. At one point, Clara whispered, "You know what moved me most in that courtroom?" "What?" "You didn't. Say my children. You said they chose me." Edward smiled, and for the first time he believed it might be true. And on the evening of the 3rd day, the phone rang. It rang 3 times before Clara answered. The judge's voice on the other end was formal, dry, but every word hit like a verdict. Edward waited on the porch, a sleeping baby in his arms. When Clara hung up, her eyes were wet, but not from sadness. "You won." The words felt like a lie. Edward didn't react at first. The world stood still. Then the baby on his chest took a deeper breath, and only then did he understand. The battle, at least for now, was won. The judge recognized the emotional bond, acknowledged the harm a separation could cause, saw the manipulation behind Richard's actions. Provisional custody was granted to Edward, and more than that, permission to pursue formal adoption. But there was something he still didn't know. Richard wouldn't let it go. That same afternoon, a new headline exploded across media sites. Tycoon loses custody to estranged son. The Hale war over 3 mystery orphans. The mansion was swarmed by journalists, cameras, drones, helicopters, but inside the house, Yinwei, there was only silence and relief. Daniel arrived with a simple cake. Clara wept at the sight. Edward didn't know what to say, so he hugged them, both, not as a thank you, but as family. Later that night, with the babies asleep, Clara found Edward in front of the fireplace. Feeling lighter? No, just whole. And now? Edward looked into the fire. Thought not of his company's, not of his family's name. He thought of their eyes, the 3 of them, and answered, "Now I stop surviving and start living for them." But there was something he still didn't know. One of the babies, the one with the sharpest cry, had a small scar behind. His ear. It always seemed like a minor detail, but that night Clara looked closer. She took a photo, sent it to an old nurse friend, a specialist in emergency births. 2 hours later, the nurse called back. "Clara, that baby went through a forced delivery. This was a botched C-section, and he may face complications later if he doesn't start early physical therapy." Edward heard the call and didn't hesitate. He phoned a private hospital, explained the situation, requested full discretion, scheduled the appointment. For the first time, he acted with the authority he had always wielded, but now it was led by care, not control. The next morning, they took the baby to the hospital. Tests were run. The scar wasn't just superficial. There were signs of severe medical negligence. The case could be reopened, and more. After cross-checking records of illegal births on that date, the medical team found a match that would change everything. "Mr. Hale, we found the biological mother's name." Daniel, when he heard it, was in shock. The name matched. It was his sister. But there was more. Records showed that the birth had taken place under threat, in the basement of an improvised shelter, abandoned weeks later. The pain of the story now had a shape, faces, dates, responsibility. Edward, faced with all of it, made a decision that surprised everyone. "We're going to tell everything. No more hiding. The truth may hurt, but it sets you free." The next morning he gave an exclusive interview. He spoke calmly, explained everything, from the cry inside the bag to the decision to fight. He didn't use emotional speeches, just truth. The interview went viral. Thousands of messages came in, some hateful, most filled with love. One stood out, from a woman in Chicago. "My son was left in a bag, not out of abandonment, but out of fear. You gave me the courage to look for him," Edward cried when he read it. Not because it was beautiful, but because he realized his pain wasn't unique, but his act was. And that night, for the first time since it all began, the 3 children slept in the same room, surrounded by glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Edward lay on the floor, watching the glowing dots above, listening to their slow, steady breathing. He smiled, but there was something he still didn't know. Richard was preparing one last move, not to destroy custody, but to shatter Edward's public image, a dossier of his past, manipulated records of emotional instability, panic attacks, attempts to escape boarding school. The final showdown was at the door. The dossier arrived on a cloudy morning. A manila envelope, no return address, left in the mansion's mailbox. Clara found it first. She recognized the pattern, the stamps, the smell of unresolved past. She brought it to Edward carefully. He had been expecting it. He sat in his study, opened it slowly. Inside, dozens of pages, childhood photos, school reports, cold notes about his rebellious episodes. A newspaper clipping, Tycoon's son missing for 48 hours. All of it gathered to paint a portrait of a broken man, someone unfit to be a father. But Edward read it all, calmly, without anger. When he finished, he placed the last page on the desk, exhaled, then picked up the phone and called Richard. His father answered with that same voice, a mix of boredom and power. Took you long enough. You lost. Not yet. I could ruin you with one signature. Then sign it, but listen to me first. Silence. You don't understand love, Dad. You never did. Because love requires weakness, and you only know how to be strong. Love is weakness. No, love is courage, and I'm done being afraid of you. The call ended in silence. Edward hung up, then stood, walked to the nursery, picked up the lightest baby, took a deep breath, and whispered, "You're going to grow up knowing you're allowed to cry, allowed to fail, and still, you'll be loved." But there was something he still didn't know. The following week, Richard was hospitalized. A mild stroke, according to the news. No visitors. No statements. And in a surprising move, he left a clause in his will. No future interference in the custody of the children. It was the end of a war, and the beginning of a life. Months passed. The house filled with sound, crying, laughter. Tiny, feet stumbling down the hall. Clara decided to stay for good. Daniel became favorite uncle, always showing up with stories and fruit. Margot came by every Sunday. And Edward? He became routine. He became home. He became arms to hold them. The adoption was finalized in a quiet ceremony. 3 new birth certificates. 3 names, carefully chosen, one to honor his own childhood, one for the woman who once loved him silently, and one for the unknown mother, the one who died before seeing her children live. In the garden that day, Clara took a photo. Edward sitting on the grass, the 3 in his lap, covered in cake, laughing loud. The photo was framed and placed by the front door, not as a trophy, but as a beacon. But there was something he still didn't know. The story touched more lives than he could ever imagine. The interview video reached millions. NGOs were founded, laws were reviewed, and Edward, he turned down awards, refused honorary titles. He only said, "I just heard a cry, and I answered." Years later, on an ordinary morning, the youngest of the 3, now 7, sat beside him and asked, "Daddy, why did you choose me?" Edward smiled. "Because before you were born, I was someone who didn't know what love was. And now? Now, I'm just you in grown-up form." The boy didn't fully understand, but he smiled. And that was enough. In the final scene of that story, Edward walked through the park with the 3, each held one of his hands. The middle one balanced on his arm. The sun filtered through the trees. There was wind, leaves in the air, and a good kind of silence, a silence full of life. They passed a woman crying on a bench. Edward stopped, thought, then walked over. You okay?" She looked up, red eyes, empty hands. He didn't ask anything else, just sat beside her, and stayed, because now he knew, when the cry is real, silence is the answer. Thank you for reading this far, but don't go just yet. On the next screen, there's another moving story waiting for you. Click subscribe to the channel and share. See you there.